Well, hello everybody. My name is Andy Stirling, a long-standing denizen of the STEPS Centre, and welcome to the session of the STEPS Summer School, where we attempt to get to grips with challenges of knowledge, incertitude, and power, and how these jargon words relate to the very practical challenge of understanding and enacting more emancipatory pathways to sustainability, which is what the STEPS Centre and the Summer School are all about. And over the course of this talk, I hope to at very least, give you a much clearer and firmer idea of what I actually mean by these three key words: knowledge, incertitude, and power, and the relations between them. And I'm really sorry that we're doing this in this horrible two-dimensional way this year, but I hope that there'll be a real chance to engage properly on these issues when we come to the interactive session after the lecture. So let's get on with it. There are many different starting points one could take, but the one I like to really begin with is to look at what you could call the origin myth of this political formation of globalizing modernity that's implicated in so many of the challenges of injustice and environmental degradation that the STEPS Centre is trying to address, along with, of course, such a wider movement. And there's a rule of thumb in social anthropology and ethnography that a quick and dirty way to at least inform yourself about the broad form of the tensions that really pervade any given society is to ask about the origin myth. Because it is often the case that in the origin myth, you will find stories about how those tensions come to be and why those who are disadvantaged by them should just give up and be resigned to their inevitability. They may be on gender, on race, on class. Well, with modernity, what is that origin myth? Well, it's not a straightforward question, but it's pretty difficult to avoid a first order answer that it's all about progress. Things progress, and modernity is about pursuing progress. And when you ask the difficult question of how it has been possible for so long for the world to be suffering from these appalling pressures of injustice, of poverty, of environmental destruction, one of the most potent reasons why those problems persist and why it's not been possible to enact all the many really fairly obvious ways to mitigate them is the idea that there is no alternative. There is no alternative because what's happening, what's causing the problems is progress, and you can't change progress. And this implicates knowledge in general, science in particular, because the received idea of progress as played out on the global stage, especially in the more elite circles of intergovernmental circles and business circles around the world, is that it is science that gives us technology, and it is technology first and foremost that drives this thing called progress. And we see this basic idea spanning otherwise really quite diverse political, geopolitical, cultural contexts, that science needs to be afforded its rightful place as driving progress, that hopes for a better life rely on scientific and technological progress, and crucially, that one cannot impede scientific progress and by implication, any interests that are associated or associate themselves with it. And we find this pattern around the world. Again, it's a generalization. The details obviously alter, but I would contend, and we can discuss this when we have the interactive session, this basic idea pervades different sectors of innovation, ranging from transport and material science, computing, IT, smart cities, the military, to the extent those issues are in fact ever critically engaged with at all, synthetic biology, energy, and so forth. And just to give you a flavor from a particular setting of the way this plays out, in the European Union, for instance, arguably the principal founding pillar at the moment of the project for European integration is the so-called Lisbon Strategy, which is all about pro-innovation action. This language of being pro-innovation is pervasive, I think, around the world, and it would be interesting to discuss this too. But certainly in a European context, that's the case. And the reason I mention this is because when you hear leaders, as it's been the case in a country like the UK, for instance, but also I think I've seen this kind of language in pretty much every country that I've engaged with the politics of, this language of pro-innovation, that the government strategy or the business strategy is pro-innovation. Let's have a think about what that really means. What does it mean to be pro-innovation? Because in practice, in all the sectors I just mentioned, the key issues of contention are around which innovation, what kinds of innovation different interests in society actually want. So for one dominant interest to say it is pro-innovation is not only being very assertive, it's actually effectively denying space even for discussion that there are different kinds of innovation. It's all one thing. Whatever innovation is what that particular interest says it is in that sector. That's how dominant interests assert their own particular notions of which way things should go in their sectors. And referring to a influential bit of work by the British Royal Academy of Engineering, broadcast on the World Service, that great colonial establishment a few years ago, in that it was quite delicious because that really set out this vision. Often leaders are coy to really explore what that might mean. But in this case, Lord Brouwers said that history is a race to advance technology. The role of government is to strive to stay in the race. A peculiarly pessimistic idea in a race, really, just to not fall over, but that's the way debate's playing out in Europe at the moment. Other countries, of course, are trying to win the race. But the point here is, around the world, in different settings, the idea of innovation is that it is a race, that the point is to try and win it, try and be ahead of others in any given sector. And the role of the public, in the words of Lord Brouwers, and that's an idea that I think is, again, quite pervasive, is to give technology the status it deserves. And if you think I'm being a little bit colorful here in picking on political statements or ones that really seem a little bit stark, let's look behind the curtain at some of the technical language that routinely gets used on the part of those advising policymakers, again, around the world, across different settings, global north, global south. I think the same kind of language is really pervasive at the moment around notions of advance, of early moving, first moving, catching up, latecomers, forging ahead, leapfrogging, falling behind. All these are technical terms used, in fact, by networks all around the Institute of Sprue, where I'm based at Sussex. But these technical terms, we don't need to go into exactly what they mean. The point is, you can see even from the metaphors that feature in their labels that they have no meaning outside the context of a race. So although economists and political scientists, social scientists concerned with innovation will say, no, this linear model of science giving technology, giving progress, we're far more sophisticated and nuanced than that. We don't anymore subscribe to the linear model. If you actually look at the frameworks that are used, especially to inform policymaking, you see that linear idea of a race is alive and well and very formative in its effects in the kinds of policies and the kinds of politics that play out around science, technology, innovation, and knowledge more generally. So in effect, what this means is that even the academic analysis, let alone the onward policy and political debates, are restricted. We're allowed to ask questions about how much of any particular technology we should have, how fast we should go with it, what the risk might be that we tolerate from it, who's ahead, who's behind, those kinds of questions, questions that are allowed by the race analogy. But we are not allowed to ask questions. The language itself is systematically deleted for questions about which way, what are the alternatives, who says, and why. Far more political questions, opening up all kinds of dimensions of uncertainty beyond this linear track. And this is odd, because in a world, again, of globalizing modernity, increasingly obsessed with notions of science-based policymaking, evidence-based decision-making, what's really odd about this is that all the disciplines involved know they disagree like cats in a bag about all kinds of things, but one thing they agree on is that that understanding of innovation is false. It is incorrect to see innovation that way. It's not an accurate description of the real world processes of change in science, in technology, in wider society, which of course is crucial. These processes are far more like this picture of an Icelandic beach, with all kinds of intersecting, cross-cutting networks of relations playing out. And in particular, if you have a particular starting point down there at the bottom of my carefully drawn diagram, what you see for any given setting where one might be concerned about innovation, about change, what kinds of change are possible in this field, in agriculture, in energy, in chemicals, in housing, in waste management, whatever it may be. The realities of innovation are that there are typically a really quite bewildering array of different possible onward pathways of change from that point that are all, in principle, equally viable. So the pathways approach is centered on this idea that the uncertainties are far more radical than is typically allowed to be understood when you're talking about a one-track race. How much should we do? What risk should we take? Because you're also not just speaking about questions of speed and risk and cost, you're speaking about the qualitative dimensions of change that are in play. And why this is important, let's take an example of, say, production of seeds, is that there are a whole series of really quite radically different pathways or directions for innovation from any given point that one might be in any particular setting around the world. Even among the advanced biotech, which tend to be highly privileged in this sector, synthetic biology, transgenics, cisgenics, apomixis, we don't need to go into the details of the differences here, just to remember that apparently quite arcane technical detailed differences often involve massively different environmental implications or political economies. For instance, apomixis, vegetative reproduction of plants, means a hugely different thing for farmers who then have the ability to select and manage their own process of plant breeding than other types of plant development technique. Transgenics, where you transfer genetic material between species, has radically greater environmental, ecological, potentially health implications than cisgenics, where the transgenes are simply managed within a particular species. So all that is just the world, much discussed as it is, of advanced biotech applications. We can look also at all sorts of different techniques for industrial production of seeds, industrial hybrids, which allow copyright protection by big business on the hybrid forms that come from the breeding programs. But beyond that, you have techniques of marker assist, which use advanced biotech, but not to actually change the genes of the plants themselves, to accelerate processes of breeding. And some of the most effective candidates for drought reduction, flood resistance, and so forth in agriculture come not from transgenics, from genetic modification, gene editing, but actually from marker assist, and not involving shifting the genome itself at all. And then beyond those kinds of innovation pathways, moving outwards into more social forms, of course, always entangled with technologies, we see all kinds of participatory breeding techniques where farmers themselves are involved, take a lead in addressing what kinds of seeds best suit their own particular environments. And of course, arguably the single most important thing about farming is that the environments differ radically, even in a particular setting. How high you are up the valley, whether you're on the north or south side, what the soil types are, can have huge implications for what kinds of crops and what kinds of varieties of a particular crop might actually suit you best in your livelihood. And it's kind of amazing, whether it be advanced biotech or conventional industrial seed production, to think that the same monoculture produced in some laboratory setting in the global north can somehow be the optimal configuration all around the world, irrespective of setting. And then there are all kinds of other innovations for open source sharing of seeds, for instance, between people rather than commercial frameworks that exist at the moment. And as I think Ian introduced at the beginning, STEPS has been involved in some initiatives in that regard, like the BioLeft project pioneered by our colleagues in Fundación Cenit in Argentina. So the point here is then I've just outlined, trying to be grounded in this, a whole series of what different innovation pathways might mean in a particular setting like seed production. So that's the kind of dimensions of uncertainty that we face, which we simply don't see if we only look at one of those and it's treated as the pro-innovation way forward in the way that the routine language of innovation tends to do in the way I introduced at the beginning. And this is important because those alternative pathways exist as possibilities, as viable possibilities, but they are systematically closed down by a series of very powerful social and political forces. And just to summarize some of these, social science has pointed out all kinds of processes of social shaping, of co-construction, of the role of imaginaries in shaping what actually happens, in the role of expectation. So for instance, that last one, just the simple property of what finance markets expect in the future can be a major factor influencing what actually happens, because the more likely finance markets think a particular direction of change is going to be, the more the less risky it seems to them, and therefore the more they're prepared to invest in it, and the lower the price of capital, because it's less risky, because they expect it to happen. But if the capital is lower, it means laying in the infrastructure, the research systems, the implementation infrastructures around the world for that particular pathway are going to be cheaper. And so you have a very positive, powerful feedback effect. What finance market accepts becomes far more likely because they expect it. Likewise, you don't have to have powerful interests like global capitalism necessarily backing particular types of change in the way I've just said, in order for there to be powerful processes of closure also unfolding. For instance, the keyboard, the one I'm using right now, is a configuration which is true in different languages, which is typically doesn't work very well at all for typing. In fact, you get repetitive strain injuries through trying to use these kinds of keyboards with fast typing. Why do we have them? Why don't we make keyboards that are actually much more comfortable? Well, the reason is we find ourselves locked in a path-dependent way to a keyboard design that was optimal in the 19th century for typewriting. And although we've gone several technological generations, automatic typewriters, computers, touch screens, we've gone well beyond that form of a mechanical typewriter that didn't want to jam the keys when you typed letters close together. But we're still locked in to a kind of keyboard that we can't actually, which we know is not very good for work practices. There's no powerful interest trying to keep us locked in. There's no sort of a cabal of plutocrats in a basement in Switzerland plotting how to keep the QWERTY keyboard. It's just the way these processes, evolutionary processes, unfold that helps to reinforce and consolidate that. But of course, when power does become involved, corporate power, government power, military power, then we see extremely strong pressures to reinforce, pressures of autonomy, of entrapment, of closure, alignment. These are all written about by various political scientists. I give you their names here in case you're interested in details. So for instance, the way in which cities around the world through the 20th century got locked into the private automobile is an example. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just path dependency. Automobile companies, fuel companies, big oil companies played very active roles in suppressing public transport around the world in different settings and promoting private automobiles. And even where we face apparently competitive consumer markets, as neoclassical economists will tell us, these markets should, where they work properly, find the optimal configuration of her technology, the optimal pathway in our language for going forward. But we find again and again, even in the most competitive markets for consumer products like software, like I'm using now, video formats, audio formats, we repeatedly see that markets lock in, even competitive markets, to manifestly suboptimal designs, because people are worried that they may think that one software format is superior to another, but they're worried other people won't choose it. So they choose the one they think everyone will choose, even though they don't think that it's so good. And as a result, society as a whole, markets as a whole, can get locked into these suboptimal designs. So those are the ways in which these diverse, possible, and highly uncertain directions for change get closed down in retrospect. So when we look back, it looks inevitable that we only had that single path, and it looks like a race along that path. Just to give you another example, because it's such an important point, the same is true in energy. It's true across the board, but just the energy example is quite neat, because arguably the challenge of delivering zero carbon energy services is the most ambitious industrial challenge ever undertaken deliberately in history. And so one would expect, with a challenge as imperative as that and as restrictive as that, to find that there really isn't much scope for choice. Let's just do it. But actually, when you look at the options available in principle that are possible to deliver energy services around the world for zero carbon energy transitions, they're embarrassingly diverse. We see radically different renewable infrastructures, for instance, continental scale deployments of wind or solar or biomass, or offshore energy of many different kinds. Or on the other hand, with renewables, you could have community renewables integrated into structures, distributed through urban and rural infrastructures, rather than taking up vast amounts of land in these huge centralized configurations. We see nuclear power making a very vociferous bid to be the principal zero carbon option. We see carbon capture and storage. We see all kinds of notions of ways in which services, energy services, can be reorganized away from the model of the utility or the large supply side deliverer of energy. And then we see all kinds of exotic ideas beyond that of ocean eco-cities, which and very high-tech visions of how we can achieve zero carbon, which have actually got quite a lot of backing, because they tend to be quite fascinating to some of the most influential interests. Now, the point is not that each of these is mutually exclusive, nor is the point that the world will only do one of these. The point is that you cannot simultaneously optimize infrastructures for all these different pathways simultaneously. In practice, society is making choices. It will have to make choices that favor some pathways rather than others and close us down. And if we don't openly address these challenges, then we get misled as to the importance of uncertainty about what directions we might take. And of course, these choices between alternative pathways are not just technical matters. They're fundamentally political. The politics of these kinds of choices that I've just outlined are really very deep-seated and very high stakes for who wins, who loses, and the kinds of impacts and the kinds of benefits and who they accrue to. So, how are these kinds of challenges routinely addressed around the world at the moment? What's the kind of business as usual practice as favored in the global governance of capitalism and so forth? And there, for instance, if you look at the World Trade Organization regime, what is the basic foundation for regulations of technology choices in agriculture, in medicine, in energy around the world? It's risk assessment. The only way really that there can be a serious political challenge to whatever an incumbent interests around the world want to develop in those sectors is through showing that the risks are not tolerable. So the World Trade Organization requires, as a matter of law, that countries can only base decisions about which directions to go with technology and innovation on risk assessment. And this appears to be very rational, because when you see a typical risk assessment, for instance, about the risks of nuclear power, and here I'm showing real data from studies that have been used in law in a whole series of different countries around the world to regulate energy technologies. A typical risk assessment produced by a government advisory committee or a major policy study or academic study that gets used in these kinds of debates looks like this. The risk is a horizontal axis. It appears to show that each of the different major energy technologies presents a particular risk, and you can order those in a really quite clear and precise way from higher to lower risk. And on that basis, you can identify which technologies tend to display the lowest risk overall. The same can be done for, risks or external costs or different kinds of impacts. And of course, different studies will disagree with each other about what those orderings are. But what they hold in common is they present an apparently neat, precise, clear picture of the relative pros and cons of different options, different pathways. The problem is that when you step back and look behind a particular study, a particular committee, at the literature that those committees and that scientific advisory process has engaged with, you see it is radically more complex, radically more diverse. So here you see a set of 21 studies, again, as used to enact law in different countries around the world on the regulation of, in this case, nuclear power. And you see the range of values in terms of the risks that these studies have obtained for the answer to the question, what are the risks of nuclear power? They're vastly different. And the same is true, albeit for different numbers of studies, but the same very diverse picture appears for all the different energy technologies. And in fact, looking at this picture of the degree to which different studies disagree about which are the more risky and which are the less risky technologies, it's generally true to say that actually you, by judicious choice of high quality, peer-reviewed science, you can justify any choice you like in terms of risk in the energy sector. The degree of uncertainty behind the scenes that's hidden by particular studies, by particular committees in the governance of technology is vast. And what you see in the policy process is an artificial simplification and reduction of that uncertainty. And the picture I've just drawn here from the energy sector applies elsewhere too, in pesticides, in pharmaceuticals, in chemicals, more generally, in transport risks. The general picture is one I'm showing of concealed uncertainty. And why is that? How can it be that these apparently sound scientific techniques can be hiding all this uncertainty? Well, the basic answer lies in framing assumptions. It's impossible to undertake this kind of conventional analysis of the risks or the benefits of different pathways without adopting assumptions. What are the system boundaries? What's included? What's excluded? Which experts you recruit? What kinds of measures you make? What kinds of weightings you impose between, for instance, health effects on the one hand, different injuries or diseases, or economic effects? What's the balance between different economic effects? What weightings do you assume between, for instance, injuries to workers? You know, how many injuries to workers in offshore wind power is equivalent to a death of a child due to inhaling particulates from emissions of gas turbines? So there's a very specific question, not how much of each, but what's the relative importance? How many childhood deaths, how many injuries equate to a childhood death? That's not a technical question, it's a political question. It's a question of political and ethical values, and yet it's treated routinely as a technical matter that can be calculated. And we see scores of these different kinds of framing assumptions in play. We can discuss some of these in the interactive session, but it's basically the point that the answer you get from technical assessment, from risk assessment, from life cycle assessment, from impact assessment, from ecosystem services, all these kinds of elaborate technical expert assessment techniques will give you radically different answers depending on the framing assumptions that are adopted within them. And although the procedures, the mathematical procedures, are really closely policed by disciplinary principles of rigor, the framing assumptions are just effectively politics encapsulated in the process. And there's no self-evident reason why one framing assumption would be preferable to another, other than political preference on the part of analysts, which typically don't get stated. So this is what we see then. We see that the particular pathway backed by the most powerful interest is subject to this kind of analysis, which has the effect, through the kinds of framing assumptions I've adopted and delivering these precise pictures, of reinforcing the lock-in. We simply ask of a particular pathway, is this safe or safe enough, or is it tolerable under world trade rules according to risk assessment? We completely neglect questions over which kind of pathways might in fact be preferable. And this has the effect then of reinforcing the kinds of choices, the kinds of pathways that deliver private benefits for the most powerful actors, and at the expense, quite often, of less powerful actors in the environments and society at large. So you tend to find techno fixes then, high technology solutions privileged over more social, behavioral responses. Supply side interests get favored over demand side interests. Intellectual property, those kinds of pathway in seeds, in pharmaceuticals, in chemicals that involve the opportunity to charge intellectual property rents, you can take out patents, they will be favored over other kinds of solutions that might be far more effective for public health, as we've seen in the pandemic, in fact, because you can't take intellectual property out on these more social public health responses. So, and these, of course, then further reinforced by marketing, by all the kinds of paraphernalia of capitalism and market strategies that we know. So we see then these interests systematically privileged of big pharmaceutical companies, agro-biotech companies, entrenched interests with often with military interests behind them, like those around nuclear power. And what gets sidelined are pathways that could have formed around cultural responses, around controlling, regulating advertising, around putting restrictions or control over supply side governance in general. Grassroots innovation tends to get sidelined. Public health measures get sidelined compared to curative measures. In other words, it's a bit like that little aphorism of, to the person who only has a hammer, every problem is a nail. So we treat these innovation governance challenges as about how to apply the dominant technology rather than which technology, which innovation, which kinds of social responses would be best for different challenges. And this kind of dilemma isn't just restricted to the routine ways in which conventional markets work. This kind of suppression of uncertainty also applies even in sustainability debates. So, and I'm caricaturing here slightly, I'm slightly simplifying for the purposes of trying to be as brief as possible. But let's take a lot of the literature on the sustainability transition. Like with a lot of other sustainability literature about the grand challenges, the nexus, we see the idea that there's just the singular transition. How often do we see the transition referred to with that definitive article, the, in front of it, as if it's just one thing, as if it's self-evident what that transition actually is, even though, as I've tried to show, it's even when we are concerned with sustainability aims, it's typically very diverse array of choices that we could in fact pursue. So we get models and missions and handbooks and manuals and roadmaps for that transition. It's interesting, these roadmaps, I don't know if anyone's been involved with those in your work, but take a look at some of these roadmaps. Every country does them nowadays, pretty much, roadmaps for this or that change. But I've yet to see an official document on roadmaps for a particular kind of innovation, which has more than one road. These roadmaps typically have just one road on them, and the purpose of the document is to just document the way that road unfolds ahead of us. So the whole point of a roadmap is when there are multiple roads, but this notion of the one-track race is so powerful, even when the metaphor of a roadmap is used, there's only one road on the roadmap. Here's a cover of a document from European Union recently that I quite liked, because it's on the front page of this document about implementing the European energy roadmap for sustainability. It actually prints in bold face right on the cover the questions we're allowed to ask: at what cost and what speed? These are the questions that this discourse allows us to ask about different types of innovations, and the uncertainties about which kinds of innovations and the broader implications of them get completely missed out. So there's plenty of examples of this. I mean, another example is in the field of responsible innovation, where on the face of it, it's quite a progressive discourse and a lot of very good people are doing really important work in that field. But what's remarkable is how the notion of responsibility also tends to take as its axis whatever is the dominant pathway for innovation and simply ask what is the most responsible way to implement that pathway, or even worse, how can we accredit and legitimate that pathway as being responsible. And an example of that was a major project undertaken in recent years by some very well motivated academics, independent academics, looking at responsible innovation. But the focus of that work was during the United States Air Force bombing of Iraq, looking at improving the ejector seat designs for pilots. So wanting to make sure that ejector seats designs were suitable for pilots of different ethnicities, different genders, that you wouldn't get some groups, population groups, being exposed to greater risks from the ejector seat because of their tendencies to different heights and so forth. So the point is, responsible innovation was being done in that field in ways that didn't even question at all whether the technology of a military bomber was in fact in itself a responsible way of conducting world affairs. And we see the same kind of issue in broader canvas, even in the environmental area, where this kind of sidelining of uncertainty takes place around planetary boundaries, for instance, where the boundaries are taken to be so precisely fixed, so confidently determined that they constitute non-negotiable control variables of the Earth, a very controlling kind of language. There's absolutely no uncertainty, say key documents, on the planetary boundaries. There's no room for compromise. Humanity is a control force. So this language of control, of prediction, is very strong in that kind of discourse as well. And the idea then, which underlies a lot of climate change discourse, is of maintaining optimal Holocene conditions. So instead of accepting the uncertainties of the climate, that it's highly dynamic, that the natural state of the climate is one of radical change over time, instead the discourse sidelines all those uncertainties, all those dimensions for different possibilities, and instead just emphasizes a particular vision of what would be preferable to the interests who happen to dominate the process of production of scientific knowledge. So that's a summary then of how uncertainties around the directions that could be taken by innovation, by social change more widely, get narrowed down in this discourse of progress, this one-track progress idea that's so pervasive around the world in science and technology and social innovation more widely. And it's interesting, it's common sense almost what this misses out, but I'll just quickly summarize some of the key dimensions of uncertainty that this misses out, the key dimensions of knowledge that get sidelined in this kind of risk-based discussion. And this comes out of all kinds of traditions, of different political traditions, of philosophical, religious traditions around the world, which I'll summarize in this kind of way. And each time, just for people who are interested, referring to some leading names that get associated with those kinds of insights. One is the insufficiency of knowledge, that actually just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should do it. In other words, that know-how, which is such a widely used phrase in this field, is less important than know why. But of course, as I've tried to show, it's the why questions that are deleted and just the how questions get emphasized. So an example of that would be human cloning or neuroenhancement, that it's simply presumed in a lot of these debates that the key question is how do we do these things and how to implement them when we do, rather than whether we should do it, why, what are the interests driving these kinds of potential innovations. The same with tissue regeneration, care robots, military robots, automated systems in the military, etc., etc. These are crucial questions that we just think, well, this is the way technology is going, and let's just ask questions about how best to implement it in tolerable ways, rather than whether we should be doing those things in the first place. To ask the question of whether we should do any of these things in the first place gets labeled as anti-technology, anti-science, and those interests behind them say they're pro-innovation in the ways I outlined at the beginning. Another fundamental dimension that gets missed out in this kind of routine discussion of pathways around the world is the incompleteness of knowledge. The knowledge necessary to do something is typically far more tractable, far more easy to achieve than the knowledge necessary to understand the consequences. And this goes back in different philosophical traditions. In Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, for instance, famously said, and I paraphrase, that not knowing one's ignorance is the best part of knowledge. That unknowns are as important as knowns. That the more that we think we know, the more that actually we can find we don't know. And so examples of this occur with nanotechnologies, for instance, with endocrine disrupting chemicals, new kinds of chemical, new kinds of material, which that very novelty, whether it be the sort of nanoscale engineered structures or these kinds of molecules that relate to living organisms in different ways than other chemicals, modifying their endocrine systems, for instance. These kinds of novelties, we know how to make them, but we simply don't know how to understand the implications when they get out into the environment. Another fundamental challenge that's missed out by this kind of language of risk, this kind of narrowing down of uncertainty that I'm railing against here, is indeterminacy. That actually, even in principle, I mean, the mathematician, the logician, Kurt Gödel, is famous for having come up with the incompleteness theorem back in the middle of the last century, which essentially says that even in axiomatic mathematics, there exists a far greater uncertainty about what might be possible axiomatically in the space of the logical space than can actually be proven to be there. And conversely, many things that will be true that couldn't even have been anticipated from those axioms. But slightly more prosaically, there's the point that when we become committed to a particular direction of change, that's when we become most vulnerable to the uncertainties. And here I have the horrible face of, I don't mean to insult, but I think it's necessary in this case, Donald Rumsfeld. These confident interests behind innovation systems, behind global geopolitics generally, typically only acknowledge these deep uncertainties when they find themselves humiliated by a massive failure. And this, of course, occurred in the disastrous wars prosecuted in recent years by global superpowers, which force those protagonists behind them to acknowledge that there are not just known knowns, known unknowns, there are unknown unknowns, things about which they couldn't possibly have been expected to know even at the beginning. This kind of language is very unusual in high-level global politics, but it comes out when there's sort of manifest failures of that kind. And these kinds of problems are very well established. For instance, stratospheric ozone depletion, the ozone hole above Antarctica, the chemicals and the innovations responsible for that. It wasn't like when they were being introduced, these halogenated hydrocarbon materials that caused the problem. When they were being introduced, it wasn't that the risk assessment system was saying, well, there's a chance that these may be lofted into the upper stratosphere and interfere with ozone there and make a hole that lets ultraviolet radiation down and causes catastrophic damage. Those risk assessments didn't say that. They just didn't even expect it in the first place. There was no probability attached to it. These were simply surprises. Then there's a problem that the more we think we know about something, the more we actually find ourselves exposed to ignorance. And a simple way of understanding that was put out by actually Albert Einstein, apocryphally anyway, again, about 100 years ago, where he just pointed out that if knowledge is a circle and the circle expands because knowledge is growing, then our appreciation of ignorance, our exposure to ignorance also grows because that's the circumference of the circle. The edge of the circle where you encounter the unknown grows as knowledge grows. So it's a metaphor, but it's quite a powerful one to refute this everyday language with innovation, that somehow if we do more research, if we understand more, then somehow our uncertainty will diminish. Well, that's refuted all the time, but it's highly inconvenient. So for instance, with ocean modeling, the more sophistication with which we have historically, anyway, in recent years, modeled the behavior of the world's oceans, the more we find that there are all kinds of unexpected dynamics that could actually eventuate, that actually the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. And this is a problem also because of the powerful interest behind some of the forms of knowledge, the modeling, the assessments, for instance, in the area of nuclear, the actual expertise concerned with modeling radiation and health, modeling nuclear engineering, modeling the possible consequences of different kinds of eventuality, including nuclear war. These are the preserve of exactly the kinds of experts who are implicated in the system itself. So the understandings and knowledge about these things aren't generated by innocent, independent, objective expertise. They're generated or influenced disproportionately by kinds of expertise that are implicated in the pathway itself. So that's another key thing that gets missed out in routine discussions of risk about different kinds of technological pathways. And I'm getting near the end of this list now, but another one is called in the jargon word incommensurability. Apples and oranges. It's the basic challenge, which is very well explored in economics actually, but then forgotten when economics comes to talk to policymaking, that as a matter of axiomatic principle, it's not possible to even define a rational social choice when you're dealing with different preferences. So for instance, it's just the point I made earlier about the difference in injuries and disease, between costs to private costs and social costs, between different kinds of environmental impacts. What welfare theory has demonstrated in economics from first principles is it's not just difficult in practice to weigh up one thing, apples against oranges, and compare how much of one thing equates with another. It's fundamentally impossible, even in principle, mathematically, to justify one settled understanding of those different priorities. It's always going to be possible to put different priorities on these things. So all these fundamental problems of insufficiency, of incompleteness, of indeterminacy, of inversity, of interactability and incommensurability, all those jargon words, which mean what I've tried to summarize on this slide, are missed out. These fundamental insights from centuries of thinking about knowledge and uncertainty are routinely excluded in the ways that these uncertainties are routinely governed in the societies we live in around the world. So what do we do about that? Well, I'm here going to end my talk by talking about practical methods. We're going to have another session later in the summer school about methods, but I'm going to point towards that here by just adopting a framework for thinking about these challenges. It's a little bit less dauntingly critical and philosophical, if you like, than the one I've adopted so far. I'm trying to pin it down now to something more grounded, more practical. And to do that, I'm going to base this part of the talk on the fundamental parameters that are used in the governance of science and technology that I've been criticizing, risk assessment. The kind of framework used by the World Trade Organization and by regulatory agencies all around the world regulating pharmaceuticals, public health, materials, chemicals, biotech, pesticides, nuclear, etc., etc. This is the fundamental framework used in all those different settings, risk assessment. Now, what is a risk? Well, a risk is a situation, a risk is a circumstance under which it's possible to quantify the likelihood with which a set of different possible eventualities might arise. So you take the thing that you think might happen, the different gradations of benefit or harm as measured by health impacts or environmental impacts or economic benefits and costs. You take each increment and you assign a probability and you treat that as then, on average, the risk over all those different eventualities that gives you an expected benefit and expected harm. These techniques are very well bedded into economics and in decision analysis. So the condition of risk then is a situation under which we know what might happen and we believe we know the probabilities, how likely it is to happen. So the techniques that get used there, risk assessment, cost benefit analysis, decision theory, optimizing models, these are the dominant ways of addressing the challenges of technology in ways I've said. Well, these deeper problems of uncertainty that I've been talking about through the talk mean that we're often in a situation where we're actually not confident in the likelihoods, not confident in our ability to assign a probability to the different eventualities. This may be because we're looking at open dynamic systems like the oceans in ways I said, or different kinds of toxic effects on animals, or human behavior might alter things. That context may be changing, the world itself may be changing, so the past is not a reliable guide to the future. All these kinds of circumstance can mean that we're no longer confident either in our models or in past experience as a basis for assigning probabilities. And for more than 100 years now, that condition of uncertainty, that condition has been given the name uncertainty. It contrasts with risk. Risk is where you know the probabilities. Uncertainty is where you don't know the probabilities. That's a distinction that's very well established, but actually quite often completely elided, because the dominant, if you look in the science journals around issues like climate change or medical public health regulation, you typically see that uncertainty is still the subject of probabilities. It's completely ignored that the word uncertainty technically and also in conventional usage really means something that goes beyond probabilities. It's treated as if there is nothing beyond probabilities. Unfortunately, the problems that I've outlined so far in the talk go even beyond that, because it's not just about how likely things are that we may be concerned about how confident our understandings are. It's also about what may happen in the first place. So it's not just the probabilities, it's also the possibilities. What are the things that might happen? So even if we're sure about what the probability is, if something has actually occurred, we may still disagree about what it is that's occurred. So for instance, a war takes place. Why did that war take place? What was that? Was it about global capitalism? Was it about military domination of one country over another? Was it about securing oil supplies? Was it about efforts to install democracy? All these kinds of different explanations are put about. There's no debate about whether that war happened, but there's a lot of debate about what it meant. Well, the same is true of every kind of innovation that you could imagine, that it's not just a question of what the different likelihoods are of different positive or negative things occurring. It's also about what they mean. What is the meaning of benefit or harm? For GMOs, for instance, are we talking about ecological harm? Are we talking about harm to farmers? Are we talking about harm to consumers? Now, what are the forms of harm that are actually of concern? What are the benefits? Is it benefits to business, benefits to the economy, benefits to marginalized groups, benefits to people who are exposed to vulnerabilities to hunger? What are the benefits? What are the harms? Those kinds of arguments are really profound, but don't get addressed in risk assessment. They don't even feature as questions. It's taken for granted that the possibilities are well established and determined. Questions about how fair things are, what the distributional effects, what the alternatives are. Going back to the beginning of the talk, the fact that there are an array of different alternatives, an array of different pathways, is typically completely missed out in risk assessment, where we just ask what are the risks of some selected, sometimes just one of them. So what are the alternatives is also a matter for ambiguity. So what kinds of ideas of the good society, whose values are in play, whose concerns and anxieties, whose interests are most privileged in the assessment process? These are deeply political issues of ambiguity, and they're entirely missed out in routine risk assessment. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have the kind of unknown unknowns, the prospect of surprise, where we are not confident either in our understandings of the likelihoods or of the probabilities. And this is where the kinds of examples come up, like the ones I mentioned on endocrine disrupting chemicals or ozone hole, where we face entirely new things that weren't expected at all, or that were the subject of these willful blinkers, where the interests in control of the risk assessment process did not want to ask about those kinds of problems because they were too inconvenient. So here is a scheme then for understanding not only different kinds of aspects of knowledge, different kinds of dimensions of incertitude, which typically get ruled out, but also the kinds of methods. And the starting point, that's why at the beginning of this talk, in the title of the talk, I called it about knowledge and incertitude, because even the use of language is often used in a way to narrow us down. Uncertainty gets treated as if it can have probabilities applied to it. Everything is treated as a risk, like that guy with the hammer for whom every problem is a nail. So the word incertitude is just an umbrella term for all these different aspects of lack of knowledge, of incomplete knowledge. And a point about this then, again, to use this picture of the dilemma, is that the reason we find ourselves around the world in the governance of science and technology and social change generally in that top left box all the time, nearly all the time, unless a crisis has pushed us out, is not because people are bad or stupid primarily, or badly motivated. The main reason is that institutions put us there. The reason why company decision makers at the top of a big multinational only hit everything with the risk assessment hammer, or major regulators or government ministers will be obsessed with these risk tools, is because that is where the institutions force them to be located. So for instance, liability law. The law requires a CEO of a company to maximize shareholder value. And, well, sorry, that's company law requires the maximizing of shareholder value. And liability law says, typically it varies in this according to case, but the basic picture is if the kind of effect that actually occurred could not have been reasonably expected, like the ozone hole, like endocrine disrupting chemicals, for instance, if it couldn't reasonably be expected at the time you made the decision, then you are not accountable. So that means then that if you're responsible to shareholders for maximizing profit, and you've got a liability rule in place, which is normal around the world, saying you couldn't be expected to be responsible if something was just not predictable, then immediately ignorance is ruled out. Ignorance is not something you should take account of. And then if you get an insurance policy where you pay a premium, the insurance and the reinsurance markets cover you, then you get moved from uncertainty up to risk. Liability takes you from ignorance to uncertainty. Uncertainty takes insurance policies take you from uncertainty to risk. So you're making a decision based on risk assessments, like the WTO insists is the way to do it. But actually the uncertainties and the ignorance have not gone away. They're still there, but the consequences are not faced by the decision makers in business or in the innovation system. They're faced by ordinary citizens, by taxpayers, and by the environment at large, especially the most vulnerable people and ecologies in those environments. So that's the basic dynamic. It is power that pushes attention up to that top left corner, not because that's the most important part of the field, but because that's the one that's most convenient. And likewise, politicians will typically occupy that top left corner as well, because they really want stories that justify the decisions. They're beleaguered, they're always pressured to make decisions. And for them, whatever it is gives the clearest storyline for justifying a decision is far more important than whether that is actually true in a wider sense. So the challenge then is to get ourselves out of that top left box. The challenge of incertitude, of addressing incertitude around different pathways for change, is by not completely dispensing with these tools of probabilities and risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis, but by just recognizing they are a very controlling kind of understanding of the problem, and that in fact there are many other methods that can be used, many other circumstances that typically only get exposed when social movements, when critical actors, collective action, political mobilization of many different kinds forces attention. So the only times when these kinds of conventional business as usual tools, the hammers for the nail, as it were, get put in their place and we start looking for other tools is when there's some kind of political crisis, as has occurred around nuclear power, around climate change, around key issues of social justice around the world. Then we find, like Donald Rumsfeld, that the privileged decision-making elites are expanding their attention to other kinds of uncertainties that normally get forgotten. So what this means then is moving to methods that deal directly with uncertainty, that don't try and put a probability on them. And there's plenty of these methods. We'll take a look a bit more about some of the implications of those later, but burden of evidence, decision heuristics, maximizing the worst possible outcome, for instance, is one. Maximizing the best possible outcome or minimizing the worst possible outcome is one difference that you can employ even under uncertainty without probability. Sensitivity testing, checking what different answers the model gives you if you explore different possible inputs and framing assumptions in the way I showed at the beginning. Interval analysis, where you don't just put precise numbers, you look at the intervals between best and worst in the ways that my earlier graphs showed. These are all ways of being more precautionary about uncertainty. Likewise, ambiguity, where we're dealing with fundamental issues of the values in play, the kinds of visions of desirable futures. We can use scenario techniques, backcasting techniques, interactive modeling, where different people get the chance to interact with the model and see what answer it gives if you put in different parameters, put in different weightings. Multi-criteria mapping we'll speak about later. Q method in a later interactive session we'll play with or have a discussion about some of these specific methods. And even where we don't know what we don't know, where we face the prospect of surprise, there's all kinds of things we can do to make society more robust in the face of that than these conventional practices of risk assessment. Civic research, where people themselves are empowered to do citizen science, to monitor their own environments, to see what's present in their environments, rather than relying on government agencies. Flexibility, prioritizing those technologies that if they go wrong, we can withdraw from them more easily, unlike, for instance, nuclear power or genetic modification released into the environment. If we find later that something is a mistake, the technologies that we might want to prioritize are those that allow us to withdraw more easily. Diversity, not putting all our eggs in one basket, experimenting with a variety of different pathways and just learning which are the better in which different circumstances. In other words, moving from that kind of controlling, hubristic risk assessment picture that I outlined at the beginning through the more ready acknowledgement of uncertainty to a kind of humility that acknowledges that what looks better or what looks worse, which pathways we should follow, depend on the point of view, depend on values as much as they do on knowledge, depend on interests, and it's fundamentally political, not technical. That kind of humility to open up a space for more robust, more democratic discussions about the politics of pathways. And this is basically what STEPS, a key part of what STEPS is about, opening up this politics of uncertainty. And this is where we've spent a lot of our efforts over the years. Most recently, we published a book, The Politics of Uncertainty, Challenges of Transformation, where the basic message is that uncertainty is not just about knowledge, it's about practice, it's about livelihoods, it's about lived bodily realities for people around the world in ways that these established techniques of dealing with uncertainty simply don't deal with. And that they're central, the politics of uncertainty is central to choices around sustainability, for instance, different pathways to sustainability in cities, in agriculture, in energy, in transport, but they're typically neglected in ways I've outlined in this talk. And even debates about transitions and transformations can sometimes treat these transitions and transformations as being far more concrete and certain than they really are. But there are, in fact, no shortage of practical research methods and appraisal frameworks and policy practices, political practices more widely, that actually can help us get to grips with this in ways I've just outlined. It's just a lack of political will. It's that these techniques are really inconvenient to the most powerful actors because they let in other voices and other interests through the door. So a key task then is to, for research of the kind that STEPS does and people in the summer school are doing in their own research, is we see it, for resisting, for challenging these pressures for closure that make us look like there's only one pathway when in fact there are many different ones. And the pathways approach tries to propose all kinds of different ideas and methods towards this more emancipatory politics of uncertainty, opening up the picture, opening the doors to interests who normally get excluded. So that's it really. I'm just going to summarize now on this very last slide the overall picture of this rather bewildering series of themes that I've tried to weave together here in the politics of uncertainty. The conventional processes of development and innovation policy around the world in different sectors, I believe, take this sound science, pro-innovation, evidence-based form that I've referred to throughout, where a particular pathway is privileged. It looks at very narrowly. If questions are asked at all about whether that pathway should be pursued, they take the form of risk assessment in this very narrow fashion, which delivers its answers to policy debates as a closed down answer, very precise, quantified, probabilistic kind of answer, which then helps to reinforce these processes of lock-in that actually took place around that pathway in the first place. That's the business as usual. And what I've been trying to say in this talk is that we can open up this more emancipatory politics of uncertainty by doing a series of things. First of all, broadening out what we attend to, broadening out the diversity of pathways that we look at, the different innovation strategies, social as well as technological, we look at, bringing in the types of values that get excluded in expert assessment, looking at the kinds of issues that don't get taken into account, issues of distribution, for instance, looking at the uncertainties that typically get ignored, bringing marginalized interests who don't get invited, being precautionary in ways that typically get forgotten. These are all different ways in which we can broaden out the picture of the pathways that we could be following. And we then have a picture much more like the one I show there at the bottom of the slide, where we acknowledge that there are the pathways that look better or worse depend on how you look at them, depend on political, not just technical factors. And so by delivering that more broader picture and being explicit about how there's not just one answer, we can help to open up a space for a more democratic politics of pathways to sustainability. A space in which those interests that are typically marginalized and excluded and underprivileged can struggle to find more easily some kind of voice, which normally gets shut down by the conventional closure. Even when it's well-meaning, it can close down a space, and we're trying to open up that space for less powerful interests to have more of a say in how these which pathways are pursued. And then by respecting diversity, that there's typically not just one pathway that's the best one, no matter how important the issue. There's typically uncertainties and ambiguities mean there's going to be a range of different possible pathways. So diversity is a quality that should be respected. And what that means is that this process, this sort of process for collective action for the wider social movements to play their roles is expanded. And in the end, rather than being some kind of anti-science, anti-technology, anti-innovation perspective of the kind that it gets labeled in the language I began this talk with, this is actually a way of being more rigorous about the realities of uncertainty. At the same time, more rigorous about the way the world is, and more democratic, more emancipatory about how societies approach that. So yes, there we are. That's the roller coaster of the politics of uncertainty. I hope this has been interesting. I hope it's provided material for you to think about. Please do look at it again if you want to check out parts that are difficult, make notes about what kinds of questions you've got, and we'll have what I hope will be a fun discussion in the interactive session where we go over these points. But I look forward very much to discussing this with everyone on the day. Until then, thank you very much and goodbye.